Please give a warm welcome to Janet Lang.
And I'm so pleased to be here on behalf of the Bay Area Council and Kaiser Permanente. We have been longtime partners for decades, actually, since the formation of the Bay Area Council. And our role has always been to help work with the council in asking the private sector to play a really important role in the well-being of our communities. And we have done that successfully, as you heard from Jim's report out this afternoon. The incredible work and reach that we have that promotes not just what is of interest to business, but really understanding that good social policy leads to good business for our community. At Kaiser Permanente, as a healthcare organization, we know that in order to create real, true health, total health, you have to look at and consider both the social conditions and the economic opportunity that presents itself to the lives of individuals and families. And across this country, we know that socioeconomic factors will inevitably impact health and your health status, more so than your access to high-quality, affordable health care like Kaiser Permanente. Right? So, and within that spirit, we've joined together to promote a number of good social policy and legislation. I want to talk about just two of them really quickly and mention them. One is around homelessness, and it ties directly to the work that we're doing here on housing and affordability, because you cannot solve the homelessness issue, the growing, really, crisis in our cities around California, let alone the Bay Area or our country. You can't solve that problem without solving the issue of affordable housing. And so that is of interest to employers and of interest to us as people in our communities and where we live. The second topic that Bernard Tyson has led with the partnership of the Bay Area Council is really in this work to reduce the stigma of mental illness. 50% of individuals with mental illness or having an emotional crisis will not seek help, even though help is available. Even if you have good health care coverage, you might not get help because there's a stigma associated with admitting that you have a mental health issue. And we all know, and if you don't know, that mental health illness contributes to hundreds of millions of dollars in health care costs. Right? Unnecessary healthcare costs, because the mind is connected to the body. You cannot have physical health without having mental health as well. Mind, body, spirit is a philosophy that we hold at Kaiser Permanente. And so we have done a lot of work to reduce stigma, from signing on Steph Curry to talk about mindfulness and resilience, right? And partnering with the council to host conversations and dialogue around how we promote and how we work and partner with cities on this whole topic of mental health access. The recent celebrity suicides this past week, Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade, right? Pretty shocking. And I will tell you that while tragic, certainly it really helps to bring into our popular culture a conversation of thousands of lives that are taken on their own because of mental illness. And so hopefully there's another world to be changed by a movement, and that's going to affect mental health. And that brings me to our third topic that we're sharing a floor on, and that's with this gender inequality. And inequality in its broad definition. It's hard for me to even believe that I would associate gender inequality with harassment and physical assault, and yet that is partly what our stories that we're sharing today. But we also have issues as employers that we've seen in terms of discrimination on employment practices, as well as pay differences, all right, with gender inequality. So I really hope that in today's conversation that we're able to cover a broad sort of spectrum of what we're faced with as we think about gender inequality as a social issue and how it's affecting our businesses today. And certainly, as we can see, the stakes are pretty high for chief executives and board members, right, and public officials in today's environment. You know, this talk is titled "A World Changed by Me Too," And I would just make a slight modification to it to say, a world changed for the better by Me Too. All right, so with that, I want to introduce our two speakers who have been coming and doing they've been on the circuit, and I had the pleasure of meeting both of them and watching them. One is Tchen. She's a really very distinguished attorney. If you're an attorney, you would know this, that she heads the Chicago office of Buckley Sandlers, but she's also their National Workforce Cultural Compliance Practice Leader. She is also a leader, one of the leaders of the Time's Up movement, working to translate sort of the energy and power of the Me Too movement into concrete steps that companies can take to create safety and equity at work. And she's also spearheaded the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. And somewhere along those 30 years, she took time off to go work for the Obama administration in a number of capacities. One, as an assistant to President Obama. Second, as executive director for the White House Council of Women and Girls. And then third, she was the chief of staff for First Lady Michelle Obama. So that is Tchen. Our second guest is Adama Iwu, another force who is local, so I'm really proud that she's of the Bay Area, so really proud of her. She's the founder of the We Said Enough Foundation, which she'll tell her story about why it was created and what really energized her, kind of put her forward to take a step out and do something very courageous. And that foundation is really, the spirit of it is to eliminate bullying and harassment in the workplace. She's also the vice president for VISA's state and local government relations. Now, in October of last year, she wrote a letter to the LA Times which talked about the pervasive culture of sexual harassment and discrimination in the California legislature. And that is how she came to be invited on these talks, and I'll let her tell her story. But I have to say that there were 140 signatures that were on that letter, and I'm very proud that two of our Kaiser Permanente government relations individuals signed their names to that petition. So very proud of you, Amy and Angelica. And lastly, I want to do a shout out for Adama because she was on the cover of Time magazine this last December as one of several silence breakers for their courage as a person of the year. So please welcome Adama and Tina. So I thought I'd start us off today just by asking each of our presenters just to talk a little bit about sort of how you started your move. Talk to me about your movement. Talk to me about Time's Up, and then I'll have you talk about We Said Enough.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you for that wonderful introduction and to the Bay Area Council, both for inviting me here in this beautiful setting, but for also putting this issue front and center and first on the agenda to really highlight its importance. So I come to the issue actually as a single working mom, right? You know, that was the fundamental. I've been my entire adult life, first as a lawyer at Skadden and then at the White House as a single working mom of two. And, you know, I shared that with the President and the First Lady, who were the parents, you know, young, both working parents of young children. The President's written about that, and Valerie Jarrett, who was chair of the White House Council of Women and Girls. She was also a single working mom. So we entered our time in the administration with a pretty acute appreciation for the challenges that working families face, for the economic benefit that we worked a lot with our Council of Economic Advisors to make clear that companies actually could do better by addressing these issues. We would do better as a country by increasing labor force participation of women. You know, we lag. We're about 12th or 13th now in the OECD in terms of women's labor force participation. And, you know, the sort of economic imperative across the board in a global economy of our needing to compete. That led me to realizing that we had many companies who came and met with us during our time in the White House who wanted to do better on issues of diversity and inclusion and equal pay, but didn't know how to. And frequently it was their lawyers who would do things like, don't do that equal pay study because we actually don't want to find out we have an Equal Pay Act violation problem. So I thought, you know, there's a business here. There's something to be done as I left the White House last year to actually start a practice, which I've now done at Buckley Sandler, to really help companies, you know, address these issues, not as employment issues, because I am actually not an employment lawyer. I'm a corporate governance lawyer. That's what I did at Skadden for 23 years, is to represent boards and directors in M&A transactions, in corporate investigations, in the governance issues that are key to a business's survival. And I believe these issues are that. We see it first in the upside business case, which there's lots of data that now show the benefits of having a diverse decision making. You know, 30% more diverse companies get 15% more return on investment, that kind of piece. But what we're living through right now in a national conversation is the downside case, right? The enterprise risk management that companies face if they do not address this issue is before us in pretty stark relief in every news cycle now for the last 9 months. So it's now clear that these need to be handled like other enterprise risk management issues. So that's the approach, specifically to Time's Up, that was born out of the moment post Harvey Weinstein stories. I give a lot of credit to the women of Hollywood who very quickly came together wanting to see what could they do that would make positive systemic change, first in their industry and then across the board, especially for low-income women, but across industries, to address the issue of sexual harassment. One of the particular concerns we flagged early on was the need for legal representation. There were many women who spoke out initially, who were getting sued or getting, you've probably experienced, the kind of backlash you get when you put yourself out there, defamation lawsuits among those. As well as low-income women who, notwithstanding the availability of attorney's fees when you have a plaintiff-side employment case, if you're a low-income worker, it turns out you can't find people to take your case because the recovery is so low if your wages are so low. So there are tens of thousands of workers who've actually suffered silently with an inability to get legal help. We started the Legal Defense Fund in January 1, announced it. It has raised $21 million, I'm proud to say, since that time, from over 20,000 donors from all 50 states and about 50 countries. It's housed at the National Women's Law Center in Washington, D.C., which is a 50-year-old women's rights organization. We've received nearly 3,000 requests for help since January 1 from 60 different industries. And it's across the board of all manner. We can get into if we want specific examples. And I'm happy to say we've had 500 lawyers step up to volunteer to take on cases at pro bono or reduced rates.
That's great. That's wonderful. Wonderful. How about yourself, Adama?
So I'm a lobbyist. I work for Visa, as kind of discussed, and we're longtime members of the Bay Area Council, so I really appreciate you guys having me here today to talk about this. Like I said, I'm a lobbyist, and I think last year after the Weinstein tape, the one where we really heard him saying such coercive, gross things like, you don't want to make an enemy of me, you want me to be your friend, I felt very personally like those were things that working in politics I'd heard a lot of times. And I see other women shaking their heads. And then the next night I went to a political event and a guy had the probably really misfortune of choosing that night to sexually harass me. Like I said, I was kind of on the slow burn already. So I was really angry about it, and it's really interesting because one of the first people I talked to was Amy, who works at Kaiser. She's a very good friend of mine, and she's a fantastic writer, and she actually wrote the first draft. I'm totally outing her. She actually wrote, you can tell her. She actually,
so proud of her.
Yeah. No, she said, I'm sick of this too. I don't even know what happened, but I want to write something. And she turned around a draft letter that probably over 1,000 women saw that weekend in Sacramento, because we started this Friday. And by Sunday night, I had over 100 signatures. By Monday morning, I had about 150, almost 150, 147 signatures. And we drafted and redrafted the letter a number of times over the weekend. And halfway through the weekend, a reporter called me, because reporters find everything out. And she was like, I want to write about secret settlements that happen in government using taxpayer funds, and I can never get them because of this California Legislative Open Records Act, LAURA, which is a total disaster, and it really only seeks and works to shield the institution and shield legislators, their calendars, anything that they do, and these secret settlements, which we felt very strongly that a lot of women had been disappeared by, and I'm sure you know about this. So I said, okay, and I talked to her on background, and I realized, like, okay, we're really doing this. So I had to call my boss on Monday morning and tell him that, by the way, I think we're going to submit a letter to the Los Angeles Times. And he was like, well, first of all, are you okay? Which, by the way, is the right answer. That's the right thing to say when someone tells you they've been sexually harassed. And then he said, does the letter say visa anywhere? And I said, no. And he said, send it to comms, but otherwise go forth. So the LA Times did run it, and it went completely viral. And after that, we started seeing legislators resign, be removed from office in a number of states. We've had, I think, about 112 special elections over the past few months because of legislators specifically for this reason. In California, we've had 4 elected officials resign. And that's really been difficult for me to kind of reconcile because we didn't get into this. None of the women signed this letter because we wanted millions of people in California to be disenfranchised, which is what happens when you don't have an elected official. And for a period of time, one district didn't have a senator or an assembly member down in Los Angeles. So that's almost 1 million people who had no representation for quite a while. But the legislature is also really was galvanized to begin working on this, and a number of legislatures have. They've decided that they're going to either change customs or they are actually going to put in processes and procedures to protect their employees and make sure that everyone is on an equal footing. And I've talked to legislators all over the country and all over the world, in Canada, in the UK, in Australia, and they're all working on this because one of the things that legislatures have done proactively is exempt themselves from many labor laws, which sounds insane, but that's a thing they can do. And they do it for reasons from things like not having to justify raises or promotions to not paying on an equal pay scale for women and men. And this is all over the place, here in California as well as in Canada and other places. So Congress is also working on legislation. It's gone halfway. They can't seem to get the Senate to move on it. So if you know any US senators, that's a thing you can mention. But I'll stay away from too many political statements, but this is a nonpartisan issue. This is an issue that Republicans and Democrats are really grappling with. And one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this when I decided to do it at the time is I mentor young women who are trying to work in politics and do different things, and they would tell me, this is what's happened to me, this is the things that have happened, and I'd say, oh, well, that was blah, 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 and this is what you have to do. And I realized I knew because they'd done that to me 10 years ago when they were a staffer, and now they are chief of staff or they are an elected official, and I was actually complicit, and I was actually part of that cycle, and I was done being part of that cycle. And so when I talk to young women who want to go into politics, because there are a lot of them, and they tell me things like, look, I went to my first convention and I was sexually assaulted, or I worked in an office and I have a law degree and I was told to just get coffee and shut up. And they're like, why would I do this? I can practice law, I can teach, I can do so many other things. I don't have to work in politics and be just diminished and demeaned. And that's why we don't have more women in politics. It's one of the reasons. Why we don't have more women in politics, why we don't have women who are interested in climbing all the way to the top, why we have women who start and then decide that they can do other things because this isn't for them. And that's another issue that we very, very much wanted to address. So we have developed an app to actually start tracking and getting, reporting sexual harassment in real time. We feel like that is a critical piece to actually having data and actually being able to give that to elected officials for them to act on. Because if you know elected officials, like more data is what they always need. And there is data on sexual harassment, it exists, but we need it at a more granular level, especially by demography and geography and by industry. And so that's something that we are working on launching towards the end of the year, and we're really excited about it. So a lot of things that are happening, a lot of legislation that we're working on, and I'm happy to talk more about that.
Oh, it's so exciting to hear how it's progressed and evolved from, and to hear that there's going to be some, sounds like you think there's going to be some staying power behind the interests and the movement, both in politics as well as in corporate America.
Well, I think so. I mean, what I've seen, and I now, this practice kind of like just took off, and so I'm working now with a lot of different companies of all sizes across the country, and not-for-profit sector as well, and doing some of the work in the legislatures. I think, as I said, the case has been made now, both upside business, downside enterprise risk. I think that's not going away. right? I mean, and I think we're all been surprised by the staying power of this particular news event, that it's not waning from the public interest. I think it's not going to, because so many people are affected by it, care about it. As more stories come out from industry to industry, it will happen. So if you're in a company and you haven't taken a look at your policies, your procedures, your diversity and inclusion, it's probably time to do that, even if you haven't had any complaints. I would suggest to you, if you're a company that looks and you look in your human resources people and they tell you we don't have any complaints, that doesn't mean you don't have a problem, because by and large, and I say the wind companies didn't have any complaints either, and that was an issue, clearly, for them. But mostly we also know from the information that we do have, 3 out of 4 victims of sexual harassment do not report. Probably the reason they do not report is 3 out of 4 of those who do report, so the 28,000 that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission got in 2015, 3 out of 4 of those folks who made a claim reported being retaliated against. And that is the prevailing view that most employees have, that why should I speak out? I need this job. I need to advance my career. If I speak out, I will be done not only at this company, but in this entire industry. And so the incentives against reporting are very high and very strong. That doesn't mean you don't have a cultural problem. And I would suggest that all of these things are tied together. I mean, this isn't just a sexual harassment problem. You can't address it just by looking at sexual harassment. And the risk to your company isn't confined just to sexual harassment, because I would submit, if your employees feel like you do not protect them on these basic safety issues in the workplace, their view is, then you really don't care about fraud laws. You don't care, I can go ahead and pad my sales figures and sell fraudulent credit card applications to somebody, or go down the list of things that one could do if that's the culture that's in your company, is a culture that doesn't adhere to basic protections and dignity for your workforce. Similarly, these issues are tied to diversity and inclusion. So this isn't a thing where you can look at sexual harassment, do a little bit of training, maybe fire 1 or 2 people, and consider yourself done and you've solved the problem. It doesn't work that way. This sexual harassment, I keep saying, happens at the tail end of the process, right? It's at the end of a process that is inherently not equitable, not diverse, not promoting women, minorities, disabled people to their fullest potential. Because if you don't have that culture already endemic, this is what's going to happen at the back end. So you can't just fix the back end of the problem and think that you will have resolved that issue for your company on a sustainable basis. You need to look at diversity, inclusion, fairness, equity, equal pay, all of those issues together with looking at the issues around sexual harassment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm really, I was thinking about you because when I saw you speak, you talked about one of the public officials who said to you, gee, Adama, it's just no fun around here anymore. I'm being honest. Like the next day, a professional colleague, not a Kaiser, right, was talking to me and said, and he's actually a CEO of a company, and he said, it makes you hesitate. It's too bad for women because it makes you hesitate to want to take them on a business trip or be in meetings or be their mentor because, you're going to get accused of something. So help me with that. I'm really curious about what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, that's nonsense. So, on its face. And I mean, probably if it goes that way, it's illegal too. So there's that. But, I mean, this is the thing that I always tell men when they say that to me, because I've gotten that a lot. Well, now I can't take that young associate on this business trip. And I always tell them, this is the thing you don't understand about that young associate, because we've all been her. When an older man in the company says, hey, you're going to come with me on this trip, we're not thinking that you might sexually harass us. What we're thinking is, oh my God, this is my opportunity to really wow this guy. I'm going to have everything in order. I'm going to have all of my questions. I'm going to be 2 steps ahead. This is my shot. That's what we're thinking. So the fact that your mind has already leapt to this place where I'm imagining some scenario that's not what's happening. I always tell men, you need to treat women like we're here with you, not here for you. Because that's the thought of someone who thinks that women are here for them. Because we're not there to work, we're not there to be an asset to the team, we're not there to be a value add, we are there as someone who is for you because we are an object. And that is, it is an entire cultural shift that we have to go through to get to this next place. And we can shift our culture. People used to smoke all the time. My mom smoked the whole time she was pregnant with me. Then the Surgeon General, I mean, probably explains a lot. Then the Surgeon General said, you know, you can't do this. So 2 years later, when she was pregnant with my brother, she didn't smoke while she had him. People used to not wear seatbelts. People used to ride in the back of pickup trucks. I guess they still do places, but you know, I mean, these are things that culturally they've shifted, and they shifted because they became anathema to the general public. There were legislators that said, we're going to create policy around this, and then there were people who said that we are going to enforce this. This is the new more. This is the new normal. And things have changed. The way that things were 20 years ago, 20 months ago, and even 20 weeks ago, we are evolving, and we have to continue to evolve there, and that's even more critical for business. And I talk to a lot of companies now, and one of the things, like you said, is that this is about creating and having that atmosphere where people feel safe, because we know that people's work increases and improves when they actually feel safe. And when you have diversity at the table, because people feel safe sharing their ideas, they might share an idea that is new and different because they come from somewhere else. And then at the end of that, people always want to know, how do we hire and retain people of color, women, and this and that? Well, guess what? At a company where I don't feel safe, where I don't feel like my voice is heard or valued, I'm not going to tell any of my other female friends or black friends to come work there. Why? Because you don't value and you're not interested in retaining and developing my career. So if I feel like this is a place that actually values me and my career, I'll tell my black friends to come work here. I mean, it's not that difficult. That's really at the root of this. Make people feel safe, make them feel like their input is valued. They will bring other people who look like them to the table. Because right now the problem is everybody who looks like the same person is bringing their same friends and their same friends' sons and kids and whatnot to the table. And so you don't have the diversity that you look for.
And it's essential in the current market. I mean, you all are dealing in markets, or you know, regardless whether you're B2B or you're a consumer-facing company, the demography of your client base is changing, right? It is going to be majority minority if it's not already. If you're a global platform, you are definitely dealing with, you know, a diverse market. And if you are going to succeed in the coming years in this changing demographic landscape, you have got to be diverse yourself. And the only way, as Adama pointed out, to be diverse is to have a workplace culture that fosters it, because very quickly, especially we're now in a tight labor market, people will vote for their feet. There is no reason somebody needs to stay in your job, especially out here in this job market, you know, in this area. You know, people are not going to stay with you if it's not a place where they feel safe and respected, and they're going to succeed, and they're going to succeed in the long run, and they're going to actually leave after you've already made an investment in them. You know, if they've learned their craft and move on, which adds to the cost that you're going to experience. So, you know, I view this as really, truly, as I said at the outset, a critical moment for American businesses to really examine this issue, elevate it into the C-suite. It's got to be a C-suite issue, a board issue, not just on a one-time thing. We're going to fix this and do it once. Ongoing. Every board meeting should be reviewing this the same way you're reviewing your tech investments and your long-term capital investments. You need to be investing in your people in this way and reviewing it very rigorously with the same rigor that you're looking at your SEC violation, you know, or your FCPA violations. You know, you need to have that level of review and seriousness of purpose. And in the end, to your question, you know, this is being professionals. This, at some level, I do say to people, it's not that hard. It's a workplace. It's professionals. It's treating all the people who work for you the same, you know, with the same level of opportunity. So you are going to take those young women with you. If you're taking the young men with you on business trips, just then treat them like a professional. Don't treat them, it's not a social occasion. It's not, you know, that's what you're not. And you're always the boss when you're in, you know, regardless of whether you're in the office or you're in the bar late at night, you're still the boss. Because this is about power. It's not really about sex, it's really about power. And understanding that dynamic and how to succeed then as a professional business in this moment in time where you have millennials who are making value-based decisions and their purchasing power, or you have workers who are making value-based decisions on where they want to work in a tight labor market. It's a really essential approach, I think, that every company needs to be taking right now.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's just such an amazing thing that we're able to have these conversations out loud, out front, and the room is packed full of men and women who came here to have this conversation. I mean, I think that this is how it starts, and people want to know, how does it start? And it starts by having difficult conversations, and it starts by having a lot of introspection on what are our policies, what are our procedures, how are we doing things, how are we looking at them, and how and when, and then also who is involved in the review of them. So, I mean, kudos to everybody who came here and knew this was on the subject, knew this was on the agenda, and wanted to be part of that conversation, because I think this is how it starts, by just being part of that.
And men are essential to this, because we're at Sheryl Sandberg. Well, Sheryl Sandberg, she gave a speech in DC last week where she said, so here's the secret, men still rule the world. So yes, they need to be part of the conversation, but more than that, obviously you are an essential part of the workforce, but as women, I will say, and I say this to my colleagues, we need to give everyone space to have honest conversations where people will sometimes say something that is heard differently. We don't, as a nation, we do not collectively have the right language. We weren't taught the right language on how to talk about these hard issues in a way. So don't be afraid to say something. I know a lot of men are saying, I can't participate because I don't want to offend anybody and I don't know what I should be saying. We need to create spaces where that conversation can be honestly and safely held, and that we as women need to hear that and be helping people go along with this and not be hypercritical. And we need to be able to talk fairly about the range of behaviors. The other thing I always say is, not every behavior is a dismissible behavior. And let's get real about that as well. Zero tolerance isn't really what we need to be talking about. We need to understand we're talking about a range of behaviors, we need a range of responses, and we need to advance and mature in our conversations about these to the point where we can have those conversations
Absolutely.
honestly.
That, I think, has been one of the, people ask, well, are you concerned about a backlash? And I'm like, well, the backlash is already happening, because when you see kind of this Twitter justice where someone does a thing and they are outed and it's in the papers and then they just have to go away, like there's no like island of misfit pervert toys or whatever. Like these people, like people's behavior, I mean, for like stuff that's, criminal activity, you can just get out of here. But for things where there are bad interactions or where they are uncomfortable, conversations or things that were said that are inappropriate, I think we as women also have to start kind of, having some balls and just saying, hey, I heard you say this. I don't know if this is how you meant. This is how I took it. And it's not a comfortable conversation to have. It's not easy to have that conversation. And maybe that's something that you need to enlist someone else in with you to have that conversation. But we have to start pushing back as women. And that's one of the reasons why I knew I wanted to do something about this. Because I felt like when I was sexually harassed, there were other people around. Men didn't step in, and they were just kind of like, well, you hugged him. I thought you knew him. And I was like, yeah, I knew him, so do you. But that doesn't mean that then I want him to start groping me and everything else. And I realized because we don't talk about this as women, we don't bring it into men's faces, they just are kind of like, they can be there and see things happen and they're like, oh, she knows him, it's totally fine. And I had to have that conversation. It's not stranger danger. Usually it's someone you know. But as women, we don't talk about this. And so this is one of these things where we have to take this moment while people are listening to women, because let's be clear, that usually it's never happened before. Like now when women come forward, they aren't calling them sluts or like giving them like, coded things in the newspaper where their face is half in shade, and then they say her husband was, or the father was never in the picture, she's a single mother, to let you know that this woman is not valid or her experience is not valid. That's not happening anymore. People are listening to women. So we have to be brave and be bold and have these conversations and bring these conversations into the light, because a lot of times people don't know that they're saying something that is inappropriate or racist or discriminatory or diminishing or demeaning. And we just have to be bold about bringing that forward.
Yeah. So it's, and we need corporate cultures and the C-suite to create the conditions inside of the workplace where it doesn't rely on individuals to have to be courageous or worry about their jobs or retaliation. And so I'm curious, Tina, when you get a call from a client and you got to go in, so what are the things that you look for to tell you that tells you this place is in trouble?
Usually, they've been outed in the press as having been a problem. So,
Already in the
that's
press?
not usually a necessary point, but actually, it does take something to bring people along to the point where usually the response is, well, that's an isolated circumstance.
Right.
That's the one, that's the outlier. Maybe we didn't handle it really well, so we just need to fix our procedure. And it takes a little while to get people to understand, no, that may just be the one that's come forward now. It's probably more endemic that you've got something more serious going on. And I totally get I've walked into more places, both startups and established organizations that do not have HR records for whatever reason. So we don't really have a good file on prior investigations. We don't really have a file on whether we got complaints or not. Or you get the standard, we didn't get any complaints, therefore we must not have a problem. That happens a lot. And that really is not going to be the case. And I think it is important for both the C-suite. You often have to bring all your executives along, so you need that. You need ownership by someone very senior to take ownership of a process that is going to uncover the rocks. And be willing to uncover the rocks now, because I'm telling you, it is much better if you uncover those rocks yourself right now. Maybe with your lawyer, in a privileged way, than to have them uncovered for you in the press and publicly, and that is going to come down the pike. And then I will say, the other piece I talk about a lot, because I've thought a lot about why are we here, all right? So we've been doing diversity and inclusion work and sexual harassment training for literally almost 3 decades now. It's been like 26 years plus since the Supreme Court case on this. We've all been doing it. We've all had sexual harassment policies. Like, why are we here? Part of it is we got to admit that what we've been doing for the last 2 decades hasn't worked. So we've got to come up with new things. The sexual harassment piece, I think, has not worked because it's all been about legal compliance. And let's face it, the law is very limited in the kinds of behaviors that are truly illegal. And a lot of the data now in sexual harassment training is it's been mostly teaching people how to legally sexually harass, because the line's pretty low. And if you don't go across that line, you can do a bunch of other things that aren't illegal. But they will be things that I would submit to you as leaders of your companies are not the corporate culture you want. One example, bystander training, or bystander intervention. It is not required, and I've seen a trainer actually say, and he was right, that under the law, it is not required for coworkers who see something to step up and say something. And it's not required for a company to protect someone who steps up and speaks out for their fellow, employee. But is that the culture you want? Is that really what you want to actually say to your workers? If, don't step up for your coworker if you see what happened to you happening, and we won't protect you if you do. Most people say no, that we want to foster a culture that actually supports one another, that empowers bystanders to speak up, because that is the only way you will change culture. That's just one example of a whole series of things that your employment lawyers are not going to tell you they're really mad at me for having told you to do, because it is taking something on that's beyond what the legal limits of the law are, an obligation that's something more than what the legal limits of the law are. But I would submit that is what, if you want to change culture, companies are going to have to step a little bit out of their comfort zone and really extend themselves to create the culture that you really want to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to believe too that the companies really have to feel like something's at stake.
Yes.
That they're, unfortunately, that there's something, they'll get in trouble. I was thinking about, Nike and how they had a big turnover in their leadership because of these issues recently, and yet they promoted their whole brand. Big part of their brand was women empowerment and athletics, and so there is a real disconnect between what they promoted, who they promoted they were in terms of their product and their brand, and then themselves as an employer. Well, and so we've been talking a lot about what's your employer brand, your employment brand, as well as your sort of the product you offer your customers.
And there's a direct relationship. I mean, you said it earlier. There's a direct relationship between how diverse you are and your ability to authentically carry your brand through. And so much of people's brands now are trying to appeal. more broadly, whether you're, whether you've got a ride platform that requires everybody to feel safe on it, or you're a hotel chain that requires people to feel safe in the hotel chain, or an apparel company that's appealing, to a broad segment, of the consumer public. And you cannot really authentically speak to those folks if you're not diverse yourself, if you're not sort of walking the walk on the safety within your own workplace. And otherwise, what happened, there's many cautionary tales, actually, in every news cycle now for you to look at of what happens when companies actually don't go deep and don't really embrace this, don't do what is very hard and uncomfortable work, but is also ongoing work. It's also not a one-and-done situation.
Yeah, I think the message around, I like the Twitter justice, I hadn't heard that term before, but it's true, you can't, your customers won't let you get away with it. Your employees will no longer let companies have that kind of environment, and so whether people want to change or not, it's going to be required, right? It's going to be required, so you may as well embrace it and move forward. And you're going to be busy for a long time.
Well, I hope so. No, but seriously, it is a governance thing. I do think the reorientation, if you start to think about this as other business challenges you have faced, right? And what you needed to do to overcome, that's what this is. This isn't just the employment relations piece that you kind of look at once a year when you're looking at performance reviews. This is a fundamental business challenge, every bit as key as others that your company may have faced in your industry, and you need to treat it as such.
Great, great. Any last words for the audience here? Any other tips or words of advice for individuals here?
There's a lot of women running for office right now. Here in the Bay Area, in California, I think almost everywhere up and down the ballot, we had women for the constitutional offices, except governor. We'll get there. We'll get that someday. But vote for women, support women, walk precincts for women, phone bank for women, even send those like annoying text messages that you get about voting. Support women who are running for office. That is really critical. In California, we're at about 22%. Congress, the same. I mean, we need more women's voices in the public sphere. That's what I will leave you with.
Wonderful. I admire so much both your stories of courage and tenacity. It's just remarkable, and I'm so thankful there are people like you in the world to help Firestar change. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.